you got to check out a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school in a new area, and you look up the person and you see that maybe they're a purple belt or a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you're like, okay, I'll stop in, try out the class. And then when you stop in to try out the class, you see the instructor, who is listed as a blue belt or a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is wearing a black belt in a different martial art, teaching the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class. And this week's question of the week was, what are my thoughts about this? I am al-Aziz, the owner and head instructor of Semper Fortis Jiu-Jitsu here in San Antonio, Texas, and I am here to tackle this week's Semper Fortis Jiu-Jitsu question of the week. So, my thoughts on black belts in other martial arts teaching a martial art that they are not a black belt in, but wearing that black belt while teaching it. At the end of the day, it's a fraud. The guy or the gal that's doing it is, it's a terminology. In my generation, because I'm 55 in a couple months, and 70s and 80s, we just called stuff like that frauds. Today, I think they would say, well, he or she just misrepresented themselves. It's like, you mean fraud? Or, sort of like, I'll read somewhere and somebody would be like, oh, it's disinformation. Disinformation? You mean lie? My generation, we called it lies. You are a liar. Nowadays, it's much more polite. It's like, oh, it's disinformation. It's sort of like, you read about a banker or a CEO of a company, and it's like, they misappropriated these funds. You mean they stole it? Because in my generation, that's what it is. You mean they're a thief? Well, they misappropriated these funds. So I go through all this generational talk to say, if a person is not a black belt in the art that they're teaching, and that's perfectly okay, they should wear whatever belt in the art they are teaching, that belt level. They should not wear a black belt from a different martial art and teach an art. Like, for instance, I'm a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I wear this belt when I teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But the school I own here at Semper Fortis Jiu-Jitsu, we also offer judo classes. And I have several black belts that teach the judo class. When I do the judo class, I take my black belt off and I put a white belt on because I'm a white belt in judo. I know some throws, but I'm not belted in judo. So I wear a white belt for judo class because I'm not an expert in judo. I'm not a black belt in judo. And, we have phenomenal judo instructors. Arthur Wright, his 3 kids, Kyle, Liam, Chantel, one time they went to the Worlds to compete in the World Judo Championship. And it would have been absolutely inappropriate for me to go with my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and teach their judo class while they're out of town. Now, we had other judo black belts, but it would have been inappropriate for me to do that because I would be misrepresenting. I'd be committing a fraud. Because that's what it is. So, could I do it? Well, I own the school. Yeah, I could do it. I would just be dead wrong doing it. And you see this. It usually happens when, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, people that have Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu programs, but like the head of their program, the black belt of their program, lives somewhere else. And the person is a black belt in some martial art, and so they will, instead of wearing their appropriate Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu belt, they'll wear, the black belt, their karate black belt or their taekwondo black belt or their judo black belt or their Japanese jiu-jitsu black belt, and they'll teach the Brazilian jiu-jitsu class. The reason that's fraudulent is the business, the lifeblood business of every martial arts school is the prospective white belt. It's not bringing in other high-level belts. It's the prospective white belt. And the prospective white belt does not know the visual difference between a black belt in Hapkido and a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. And then some arts are even more deceiving. I want to say I was in North Carolina one time and there was a karate black belt. He was a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. But he would teach with either his he would teach his Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class with either his karate black belt, or it was like some martial art that I'd never heard of called pancration, which is a fighting tournament, but they called the martial art pancration. And then they even stuck some red on the tab to sort of make it look like a Brazilian Jiu-jitsu black belt. But it wasn't a Brazilian Jiu-jitsu black belt. And so if you're teaching a Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class and you're a blue belt, that's cool if you're wearing the Brazilian Jiu-jitsu blue belt. But if you're teaching the Brazilian Jiu-jitsu black class and you're wearing a black belt from some other martial art, especially some other martial art that's got some red on it, it's like you're creating a deception. It's a fraud because the prospective white belt that comes in just says, oh, here's a Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class. The person teaching it's wearing a black belt. They must be the expert. They must be a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. But they're not. They're a black belt in something else. And there was even a guy here in San Antonio. I would see him on his pictures, and he was a black belt in some other martial art. But I want to say when I first got here in 2016, I think it was a purple belt. He was a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. But every time he taught classes, every time he showed up at a seminar, he'd wear his little, other martial art black belt. And then finally, somebody gave him a black belt. And I said, now, if he was honest, he would continue to wear that other martial art black belt and teach his Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class. But what do you think he did? He now proudly wears his Brazilian Jiu-jitsu black belt and teaches his Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class. He wouldn't wear his brown belt and teach his Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class or his purple belt. But he'll wear his Brazilian Jiu-jitsu black belt to teach Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class. So there's no other way to look at that other than fraudulent and deception. It was deceptive, because the new prospective students would come in, they would look at the guy teaching class, he's wearing a black belt. They don't know the difference between one black belt and another. They just assume, this person is a Brazilian Jiu-jitsu black belt. And they are not. So that's my thoughts on if you go to a school and you're looking to try out some classes and you see a person wearing a black belt teaching the class that is not a black belt in the art that they are teaching, I would recommend you turn around, walk out the door, because these guys are frauds. Now, I know there'll be people making comments like, they got reasons and we shouldn't be judgmental. In my generation, we was judgmental. Be like, oh no, it's not misrepresentation. It's fraud. And you're putting on a marketing fraud, deceiving prospective students to come in as if you are an expert in an art that you are not an expert in. Be proud of your expertise in whatever martial art you are and teach those classes and represent that. But if you are, like me, a white belt in judo, show up for the judo class in your white belt. And I got students, my Brazilian Jiu-jitsu black belts, they show up to judo class in the appropriate belts. Like they'll show up in their, if it's a white belt, a couple of them are orange belts. I think got a yellow belt. I think a couple of them just got their green belts. They show up in their appropriate belts, not their Brazilian Jiu-jitsu black belts. And my judokas, when they show up to Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class, they show up in their appropriate belts. And then I got like all-star students like Krishan. She is a 2nd or 3rd degree black belt in Taekwondo, but she comes to Brazilian Jiu-jitsu class in her blue belt. And she goes to judo class, I think, in her white belt. Or she may have gotten promoted, I'm not sure. But, she is an expert in one martial art, but she recognizes her novice status in the other martial arts and doesn't try to pretend that she is something that she is not. And that's what a true martial artist is. So you leave your ego at the door. You hear that in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu all the time. Leave your ego at the door and wear the appropriate belt for the appropriate class you're in. So that's my answer to this week's question of the week. You got any experience with that? Feel free to comment below. Give your thoughts and insights. And if you got a question for next week, fire away. All right. Ciao.